everybody, and welcome to the CEM homework review video for Block 2, Week 3. This is the video for the verbal reasoning homework, and my name is Luke Lloyd. Let's get into it. So looking at the homework sheet, we're obviously doing Week 2 of the homework. This was a matching antonyms and antonyms lesson, or antonym homework to pair with what the content we covered in the lesson. And we're, to start with, going to be using this book here, which is the Verbal Ability for 11 Plus book. And to start with, the first one is on page 63 through 69, so a few pages for us to get through. Obviously, not all of them necessarily questions right off the bat. So to start with, we have down here a matching exercise for matching the antonyms, and you can write the possible answers below. When they give you a grid like this, I recommend filling in just in order, one by one, writing them down, and then only when you find a pair, going back and filling it in. And if you do that, you'll end up with something that looks like this. And you can see here are a collection of answers. So obviously to split and combine, to mount and dismount, to be rude and polite, cheap and dear obviously means doesn't cost a lot or mean costs a lot, furious and content, bright and eerie, hinder aid, raise lower, safe and risky, demolish and build, lead and follow, smile and frown. And hopefully you can see how I went, split, dismount, rude, cheap, and so on, and then only adding in words once I found combine, I then added that with split, and that way built up my answers. Again, really important with these that you know the meanings. One of the big things I'd say for all the verbal reasoning homeworks, again, I'm not as concerned about what you initially get in the first test. I'm more concerned about what you would get if you did it again. Have you learned all the words? There's so many words for us to expose you over the course, or expose you to over the course of the year, that we're going to try and give you as many words as possible, be it through these homeworks, be it through the spelling test, all of these opportunities to increase your vocabulary. So please make sure you're studying that, you're working towards increasing and learning. So if there's any words in here you didn't know, define them, write them in your reading book, and learn them, please. So then moving on, if we look at an example here, we can see we've been asked to select a word that's opposite from varied. So again, we think about the meaning of the term varied. We possibly consider synonyms for the word, words that mean the same thing, because perhaps there might be a word that's easier. So if things are varied, they are different. So I now want the opposite of different. That doesn't mean I could cross out the synonym in the list if I find it there. But things are varied, they're constantly changing. Well, the opposite of things that are changing would be things that are constant, unchanging. And so I think there is your best option. And that's the kind of process that I'll be going through. I'm thinking about it. And that as a method, I think is very powerful. Let's just read through the technique together just to make sure we've got it. So again, we read through the word of the letter to think about its meaning and a possible antonym. Sometimes simplifying on the word will help. So as example, so varied, changing it to different. Oh, there you go. It's like they knew what I was going to say. Number 2, look at the other words and think about their meanings. Can you rule out any of them? So diverse and different being synonyms, we can get rid of those. And if time allows, putting it into a sentence can help. We didn't have to do it in that case, but of course putting them in sentences, as long as the meaning of the sentence changes, becomes opposite, then quite often you know you found yourself a synonym. And then finally, of course, double check that the word is opposite and you haven't chosen a synonym. We see this so often as a silly little mistake, especially because we often practice synonyms and antonyms together relatively similarly. I know the week before last we were doing synonyms. This last week we were doing antonyms. It's very easy to get them mixed up, so just always have that double check. And personally, I will always underline in the question, is it a synonym or is it an antonym? And so for here, I'll always just, for example, underline the key instruction just so I don't make that silly mistake. And I certainly think that's advisable. Right, so now moving on to the develop section, let's just talk through the answers. Again, I'm just going to sort of pick out any words that I think are particularly difficult, be they answers or any other options. And please, this is again so important. Just because, for example, present and absent was the answer today, it doesn't mean if you weren't sure what the gift was, that might very well be the answer next time. So just because today some of these other options might not be the answers, it doesn't mean you should avoid learning them. I would really strongly advise to learn all the words you can. And one little tip that I really like is if there is a word you don't know, so if you didn't know what awful meant, for example, you might write, for example, a synonym underneath, and in that way you can really quickly build up a fantastic library of words, a catalogue of words you need to learn. And I would do that for any of the words underneath. I would just quickly write a synonym underneath just to make sure you're learning those words, and then you can always come back to this book and look at the words again. Okay, let's go through it. So number 1, if you are present, it means you're here. So if you're taking the register and someone said present, it means they're here. The opposite of being here is if someone is absent, not here. Number 2, to admit something means yes, I say yes, that's the truth, that did happen. To deny is to say no, it didn't happen. So if you deny an accusation or you admit to doing something, they're opposite. And normally, of course, if you accuse someone of something, they either admit it or deny it. Worst, if something is the worst, it's awful and terrible, can't be that. So the opposite of the worst is the best. Number 5, none versus all. I ate none of the cakes, right? All of the cakes, they're very different in meaning. If you blame someone for something, you attribute blame, you say how bad they've done, the fault. The opposite would be to praise someone, to say how well they've done because of an instance. Number 6, if you lend someone something, well, if you're a lender, you give something away on a temporary basis, and the person you give the thing to is the borrower, the person who borrows. So lend and borrow are opposite ends of the same side. Number 7, junior and senior. We're thinking about junior school and senior school, and also juvenile is another sort of root word. Again, junior meaning younger, senior meaning older. Number 8, things are heavy and light. Obviously in here, sort of dark, shadow, light, they start getting you thinking about the different meaning of light. Don't be distracted by that. In here, obviously heavy weighs a lot, light meaning not weighing very much at all. Number 9, you're either strong or you're weak. They're opposites. If you hate something, well, the opposite of hating something is loving something. And loathe here is a fantastic word that means the same thing as hate, and it's well worth learning if you didn't know it. Not the answer this time, but quite often I've seen loathe as a question that does come up. We're now going to look at the time test together. One thing I will say about the time test is if for any reason you didn't finish it, please do go back and do so. I think it is more important that you expose yourself to these words and give yourself the chance to exceed and just see these words and try your best, then come back and we'll go through the answers together. I think at this stage of the course, it's more important to try all the questions, to expose yourself to different questions, to come across the words, than it is to stick rigorously to time. So if you've not finished this, go back and do so. Otherwise, let's go through and do the answers together now. So if you attend a party and you are the guest, it means it's not your house, you're the visitor. Whereas if it is your house, it means you are the host, you're the person who's put on the party. So that's opposite ends. If someone is cursed, it's an evil thing, it's a negative effect on you, whereas a blessing is something positive. And so you might bless someone if they've sneezed, for example, to try and get rid of whatever's causing the sneeze. Number 3, if you separate something, well, the opposite is to separate means to take apart. So the opposite of putting apart or taking apart is to combine and put back together. Number 4, if you're very cheerful, you're happy, you're smiling. Well, if you're the opposite of that would be to be very grave. And often if you hear someone have a grave expression, it means they've got a sad, dark, angry, negative expression. So very unhappy. So grave in this case. Describing someone's demeanor or attitude means very negative, unhappy. Number 5, if something is closed, it's shut. But as we know, if a door is when is a door not a door? When it's ajar, is that a common riddle? And ajar simply means slightly open. So ajar meaning in this case open. Number 6, the supply and demand. You often hear about how trade is all about supply and demand. A supply of something means if I have lots of chocolate, I have a supply of chocolate, I have a stash, some of it saved up, whereas my students in my class often have a demand for chocolate, they want it. So supply in this case is an excess and demand is a want, and normally they pair together as opposites to make things like economies and trades happen. If things are healthy, it means all is well. If things are diseased, it's very much the opposite. It's a negative, and it means in need of medical attention or fixing. Number 8, dawn and dusk here are very clearly opposites. Dawn is when the sun rises and dusk is when the sun sets. So they're clear opposites. One thing I'll say about twilight, twilight is what we describe as that in between light and dark, and actually twilight would occur both at dawn, or just before dawn, and just before dusk, when the sun is sort of just dipping over the horizon. That is actually what twilight is. It's between light and darkness. Twilight, between. That's where the twi comes from. Number 9, the opposite of being rude is polite. We've seen that before. Number 10, the opposite of something that is voluntary, you volunteer for, means you say, oh no, I'm happy, I'll put myself forward, is something that's compulsory. You have to do it no matter what. So voluntary means you have a choice, compulsory means you have no choice. Number 11, external meaning outside, internal meaning inside. So interior and internal are probably synonyms. And in fact, external and exterior are synonyms as well. Number 12, we have odd and even. Oh, sorry, that's one thing I will say about number 11. Obviously, interior is close, but remember, and this is just worth highlighting, select the most opposite in meanings. It's important to realise that obviously interior and external, they're close, but since internal is a better option, external, internal, much closer. Again, you see the root word is closer. That's why internal is a better option. So don't please just jump at the first answer, because with this style of question, and for synonyms as well, when often you're doing closest in meaning or furthest in meaning, there might sometimes be a better option. So it's important, even if you find one that's close, to still consider the other options in case there's a better answer. Number 12, if things are odd numbers versus even numbers, they're obviously opposites. If things brighten, they become clearer. If things fade away, they become less clear, harder to see. The opposite of being powerful is feeble, in this case powerful and weak. So feeble meaning weak, obviously weaker is close, but feeble in this case is a much better, a much closer answer to being the opposite. If someone is wise, they're very sensible. If they're foolish, they are the opposite of that. They're not sensible, they make mistakes. They've not learnt their lessons. Number 16, fresh food obviously is newly made, whereas the opposite of that is stale food, food that's very old and starting to go off. Seldom is a great word to say if something happens seldom, it means it happens rarely, whereas frequently, of course, means often. And so rarely and often are opposites, so seldom and frequent are opposites. Number 18, nice and easy, to grow and shrink. They're opposites. One means to get bigger, the other is to get smaller. Number 19, a valley. If I was to draw a valley, here's your hills, and then suddenly a valley dips down low, and normally a valley will be caused by sort of water. Obviously, you can see here's a dip. Well, just the opposite in that in terms of shape. If I had to sort of, and then suddenly, we'd call that a hill. And so if you look, there's your hill, there's your valley, and they're opposites in shape. Number 20, if you're very proud, you can often be described as being sort of vain. It's good to be proud of yourself when deserved, but not to be too proud. And the opposite of being proud is to be humble. And normally we would consider humbleness a virtue, a good thing. It's important to be humble and not boastful and not overly proud. Although equally, if you have done well, it's entirely okay to be proud of yourselves, and the better to have others being proud of you. I think that's a far better way of being. So again, if you're humble, it means you're not overly proud, you're not boastful, you're just quietly content. 21, if you grant someone their wish, it means you give them their wish. So if someone says, please may I go to the toilet, and the teacher says, granted, yes you may, that means they can, whereas obviously if you refuse a request, it means you say no. 22, if something is trivial, it is unimportant, therefore the opposite is important. Obviously important and unimportant being opposites. 23, if something is intentional, it is purposeful, it is done on purpose. The difference being, of course, if you make a mistake that is accidental, it's not on purpose. So please be aware, of course, the opposite is accidental, because intentional and purposeful on purpose mean the same thing. So I did something by accident or on accident versus I did something purposefully. Are the opposite ends. If something is knowledge, it is something that is known. So, for example, we have knowledge now of how to make a car, whereas it is unknown how to make an alien spaceship, for example. Things that are known and unknown. Number 25, if you're very strict, you're very harsh, you don't often forgive, the opposite of that is to be lenient. And quite often lenient and soft in this context, it teaches a bit of a soft touch. It means they're very lenient, whereas they're very strict, very powerful, they're very harsh. They don't let you get away with things. I think it's important to be balanced, not too soft, not too harsh. 26, if things are boundless, is a great word. It means they are sort of limitless, or you might talk of a bountiful prize pool. It means there's plenty. Whereas in this case, empty being the opposite, you might describe as the desert being empty or devoid of life. There's nothing there. Whereas if there's boundless creatures and boundless species, it means there's endless. So the rainforest, for example, you might describe as having boundless species living within it. I think the important root here is to realise that boundless meaning no bounds. And in fact, I think I've often most heard it think we have boundless opportunities, endless opportunities, loads of chances. 27, obviously if you're lazy, you're relaxed, you're not paying attention, the opposite I think would actually be, sorry, not alert, but industrious. If you're lazy, it means you're not working hard, whereas to be industrious, it means to be very hard working. I'd write that underneath. That's a good word, industrious. And it's important to be, ooh, come on you, there you go, hardworking. And again, guys, this is an example of how I'd be using my books to just really fill out and plan things. So industrious means hardworking that way. If I wasn't sure, I could always come back and check. Another fantastic word is eloquent. I try my hardest to be eloquent. I don't always achieve it, but eloquent means very well spoken. It means you speak clearly and precisely using wonderful words. And of course, that's another advantage to building a strong vocabulary is you increase your eloquence, your ability to speak and communicate. And that's something that's just incredibly important life skill generally. So the opposite of lazy is industrious or hardworking. Obviously, to be an optimist, the opposite is a pessimist. The classic example is, do you have a glass half full, which is the optimistic way to say, yep, I've still got half left, or is it a glass that's half empty because you've already drunk half away? And again, I think no one is all one thing. I think there's different occasions people consider different things, but again, the point is, either way you look at it, this is the same glass, and how we look at this glass being half empty or half full is very much depending on our outlook. And it's, I think, far happier if you can be to be optimistic more often than not. Always look on the bright side of life. Number 29. The opposite of poetry. This is a difficult one where I might go through. I think poetry is closest to being the opposite to a song. In terms of song, as where you sing, it's put to music, whereas poetry is written text. You read out loud, much the same as you would read a verse, a prose, or a sentence. And so in how you interact with poetry, I think a song is the most different. And this might be one where I go through and sort of say, well, no, that's close to poetry, and that's close. And that way you actually cancel out the options. Tough one, I think, number 29. Number 30, obviously, if you have great amounts of wealth, I think the opposite here is probably to be in poverty. And so obviously, if you're very wealthy, it means you have lots of money. The opposite of that would be poverty, which is a lack of money, a lack of wealth, a lack of treasure. You could be in debt, but just because you are in debt doesn't mean you're not wealthy, actually. And so I think that's why, although debt's not bad, poverty is a better answer. Okay, guys, that's the 30 questions. So now we would move on to antonyms where we're going to insert the letters. I often tend to find these are a little bit harder. And so we'll talk out how we go. In here, antonyms, little exercise just to sort of catch up. It's worth building up sort of word banks for the more popular words. So I think for these, what I'll do is rather than copy them out, I'll just talk through them. So obviously in here, we're doing antonyms. I want as many words the opposite. Quite often, the way I would do it is think of one antonym for happy. So for example, sad. And then I might consider, well, all right, what are synonyms for sad? I know some people find that easier to think in terms of synonyms. So obviously, sad, you might then go with unhappy, woeful, lamentable, upset, crushed, heartbroken. These are all opposites of being happy. Discontented, all fantastic words. So any words that you have are absolutely potentially correct. So the opposite here, the opposite of create is to destroy. So other words that mean destroy might mean demolish, tear down, ruin. And in that way, again, I'm sort of considering words. Small is fantastic. So from small, I'd go to large. And then there's a myriad, meaning loads of other words that mean the same as large. So I might have large, gigantic, humongous, colossal, titanic, vast, massive, mega, all words meaning large, which are, of course, the opposite to small. Wealthy, we have poor, in poverty. You could lacking the means. All words means you don't have wealth. Obviously, poor probably being the easiest. Compliment, the opposite of a compliment, I think would really be an insult. So a compliment is where you say something that makes someone feel better. The opposite, I suppose, would be an insult, and it's not something we try and do and try and avoid. But an insult or a slur or something that's offensive would be the opposite of a compliment. And finally, opposite of being slender, slender meaning thin, well then the opposite of thin would be wide, vast, large, perhaps overweight, or could be opposites of slender. So there are a few options that you may well have had. Looking at it now, how did you get on? Again, remember thesaurus is very useful. Personally, one thing I would suggest is because you're not going to be allowed a thesaurus or dictionary in your exam, please don't feel like you have to train diligently in the use of a thesaurus. I think you should know how to use one, and that's an important skill. But certainly, in terms of learning words, we don't want this homework to be painful. I would recommend using an online thesaurus, an online dictionary, the internet, because it's far faster. And to my mind, if you can learn or if you can discover the meaning of words more quickly, it's my hope that then you'll use that time to learn more words. And that really is the goal, to expand your vocabulary, to incorporate more words. So again, remember when answering these questions, you must always select the same word class. So the word on the left below and it is a verb. So the opposite should also be a verb, and that's a lovely hint. So again, adjective, adjective, noun, noun. The words will often be the same type, and that's very important. So here let's just go through. So if you bellow, it means you shout. The opposite of shouting would be to whisper. And here, if you look, whisper is an antonym and a verb. Bellow is a verb. To bellow, to whisper. They're both doing verbs. Doing words, and that's important. Whereas to be quiet is an adjective, and that's a great way of sort of ruling out a potential option. And obviously, bellow and scream are synonyms, and actually so is to bawl. So you can remove the synonyms, remove the one that's not a verb, and you can actually get your answer that way if you didn't know what a whisper was. And that's a useful little thing to realise you're able to do. Oh, and here's a lovely little tip just at the end. So it says, remember to look for certain prefixes and suffixes. So here, obviously, you've got appear, disappear, healthy, unhealthy, expensive, inexpensive. You might also have happy, unhappy. These tend to be quite obvious and jump out to you, but then don't be afraid to use, for example, as we saw earlier, I used happy, unhappy, then as a jumping point to go through sad, woeful, and all the other words. And so do be on the eye out for those, because you can often use those to get an easy answer and use that as a jumping board to think up new words. So if you look at this example here, complete the word on the right, to spell a word that's an antonym. Again, I'm looking now at certain, and I'm thinking about what it means. Now, obviously, certain in this case is quite useful. If you are certain of something, it means you're sure. The opposite could be if you're uncertain, and that's incorporating the prefixes as we discussed earlier. So that was nice and easy. So I think the answer here is actually going to be uncertain. Uncertain. One thing I'll also suggest is obviously if it doesn't look quite right and you've got a little bit of time left, it can be worth, only if you're unsure of an answer, writing out fully in your own words, because that can then make it a little bit clearer. So uncertain. Ooh, 1T. And then actually just seeing it written on its own can actually really help you think, oh, yeah, that does look like it's spelled correctly. It can be different when your sort of fonts of your handwriting doesn't match the style. That's one little tip. But sorry, just generally, one thing I would always say is if you're not sure, it can be easier, of course. Don't forget, make this word easier. So certain means things you're sure of. If you're not sure, you are uncertain. In that way, that's how I'd approach a lot of these. Make it very easy for myself to find possible answers. And here's just a recap of the technique, and you can have a look through that, and you're more than welcome to copy it down if you want to. But of course, remember this is in your book. Okay, so here are some answers together. What I'll do now is we'll just go through and fill in the answers. And in fact, here's one of those magical moments where I can say, here's what I did earlier. So let's just run through them together. So we've got abandon and claim. If you claim something, it says it's mine, I want it. If you abandon it, it means you relinquish your ownership of it. Number two, if something is complete versus unfinished, not yet done. Immediate and gradual. So obviously gradual means slowly over time. Immediate is instantly. Number four, isolated and accessible. Accessible means can be accessed, whereas isolated means it can't be. So if you're on an isolated island, you can't get there by walking or by plane, or goodness knows, you might have to get a boat or some such to actually get there. Number five, success and failure. You succeed or you fail. Number six, probable versus unlikely. So it probably will happen or it probably won't happen is another way of thinking about those two. A union and a separation. Obviously, separation is going separately, going its own ways, coming apart, whereas a union would be the coming together, the bringing together of things or people. Number eight, turbulent and calm. Turbulence on a plane is when it starts to shake, or a boat, if there are turbulent waters, it means it's up and down, it's choppy water. Whereas nice, calm, flat, without danger is the opposite of that, obviously. A hoax versus an original. So if you're talking about a painting, you might have an original painting, or you might have one that was a fake, made as a hoax, made as a pretend. Number 10, to observe something. Now, although we know that observe might mean to see, also you observe the rules, which means you do as you're told. And so your options here would be to observe the rules and do as you're told, or to disregard the rules and not do as you're told, and often not the best idea. Number 11, mellow means calm, means calm, placid, whereas harsh obviously is teacher's very harsh, it means they're very strict, which again is the opposite of mellow. Number 12, gregarious and reserved. If you're gregarious, it means you are a going out person, you like talking to people, you're very friendly, you enjoy communicating. Whereas if you're a bit more reserved, you're a bit more, can be shy, but even just, a touch more calm and, maybe takes a little bit of time to sort of warm up to new people or places. And obviously, both are lovely and fine. Number 13, inedible. So not edible versus palatable, which means very happy to be eaten. Your palate is the roof of your mouth. So if it's palatable, it means it's almost like putting in your mouth-able. It's able to. It's a pleasant thing to be put in your mouth. So edible is the best example there. Interested and bored. Obviously, we know what those mean. Just and unfair. So like fair and unfair. Neat and disorderly. If you're disorderly, it doesn't necessarily mean dirty, but it means everything's in a chaotic jumble. It means you're not really sure where everything is, which is very much the opposite of being neat. Number 17, obviously you have an objection or approval. So, for example, if you are asked to do something or ask someone's opinion, an objection is going against, where an approval is for. So, if you approve of something, you're for it. If you object to something, you think, no, not for me. No, I don't think that's right. Traitor and patriot. Obviously, a patriot is someone who is loyal. A traitor is somebody who is, well, a betrayer, someone who is not on your side. It's not a good thing. Number 19, to wound and heal. That's like hurt and heal. It's like a wound, could be a cut knee, for example. Number 20, weary versus energetic. Essentially tired or sleepy versus full of energy. Profound and trifle. If something's profound, it's incredibly important. So a trifle, unlike the dessert, is just something that's, it's just a trifle, doesn't matter, unimportant. So essentially you could think of this as unimportant and important as the two words. 22, we have superior and inferior, meaning better and worse. We've got stout and slender, so that can be sort of basically fat and thin, although stout tends to mean a bit more broad than fat, so you can be broad versus thin. 24, imprisonment versus freedom, obviously that's being jailed or let loose, set free. Inaudible means can't be heard, and hopefully I am nice and audible. Hopefully, if I'd rather be loud than unable to be heard. Inaudible, good word that. So they're obviously the opposites. You have friend and foe. Your foe is your enemy, so it's like ally and enemy, friend, foe. And And fatal, if it means something is fatal, you can die of it. So the opposite would be something that's harmless, that can't hurt you at all. We've talked about interior, exterior. We've got divine and mortal. So the gods are divine, they live forever, they can't be harmed. Whereas things that are mortal, they don't live forever. And sadly, as far as I can tell, we're all still mortal. And then you hear about sort of Greek gods. You also hear about the mortals, which is us humans, and the divine gods and the things that they get up to. Finally, of course, things to dwindle and expand. If things expand, they grow, they get larger. Whereas if you talk about either resources or patience, or if anything dwindles, it becomes less. You get less of it. So I think, for example, you might hear about resources dwindling in a mine, for example. So you've got an iron mine. If the iron starts to dwindle, it means it becomes less. There's less of it there. If your patience starts to dwindle, it means you're running out of patience. So it means to become or to have less of something. Right, everyone. That was a bit of a quick run through those last ones. There's not as much I can say on those. Again, in terms of tips, writing them out again just to check and really going through and trying to turn this word into something that's easier so that you have a better chance of accessing these words. And again, just thinking of maybe any synonym and then trying to get your synonyms, sorry, any antonym, and then thinking up words that mean the same that then possibly fit you're missing. They're the kind of hints I would give. But very well done for getting through all that. Right, guys, that was the verbal reasoning lesson. There will be a non-verbal reasoning homework out as well, so keep an eye out for that. Hopefully it was useful for you all. Thanks so much, and I'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye for now.